Welcome, everybody, to our Thursday Night Coach Chat. And tonight's topic, we're going to talk about speed work, which was on your newsletter this week, but more in detail, thresholds and what are thresholds and what do they do for you. And it's really a continuation of last week's discussion where we talked about thresholds as opposed to having pertaining to, I should say, um, resources for fuel, carbohydrate in the form of glycogen that resides right in your muscle, and then fat. Those are the two predominant resources that we endurance athletes use for fuel. But tonight, and we talked about how as your heart rate is going up and up and up and up, your fat consumption is going down, and your glycogen consumption, meaning carbohydrate consumption, is going up and up and up with higher heart rate. So, what are those thresholds? What are those heart rate levels that we humans have generated, and what do they do? So let's dive into it. Again, thank you all for coming today, as the little sign suggests. And let's get rid of that. And this is me, for whatever that's worth. I don't know. Yeah, I guess it's kind of updated. No, yeah, I guess it is. Anyway, that's the book that I co-wrote. And here's a trick question pertaining to what we discussed last week. And I actually gave the answer last week very quickly. What mile do you hit the wall at? And why do you have to hit the wall? Anyone have an answer to this question? It's kind of a trick question. Anybody have an answer? You want to scroll your cursor across the screen, and you can click on that little audio button that has a little kind of an ancient looking icon of a microphone. And you can click on that and you'll be able to speak, or you might be able to type it into the chat, but I don't see any new chat. I'll give you the answer. You don't have to hit the wall if you're taking in enough calories, specifically in the form of carbohydrate. That's the trick answer. But the other thing is if you think about it, if you don't take in anything, your body only has enough calories that it absorbs that it will start a race with, as long as you eat enough over the 3 days leading up to the race. And I don't mean stuff yourself, because you can only absorb, here's the key, you can only absorb 2,000 calories, roughly speaking. And the bigger the person, the more you can absorb. The smaller the person, the less you can absorb. But the average person, call it 150, 160 pound human, men and women, whatever, the average person can absorb about 2,000 calories. Now, here's the kicker. The average person, I said this last week, can utilize about 100 calories per mile. So divide 100 into 2,000, and what do you get? Mile 20. That's where most people begin to hit the wall who aren't taking in enough carbohydrate. Get the picture? And when you hit the wall, what that means is your carbohydrate volume, meaning your carbs turn into blood sugar, also called blood glucose. Blood glucose turns into, or blood sugar turns into glycogen. It resides right in your muscle in this white honey-like substance. And there you go. So the moral of the story is, as a takeaway from last week's discussion, and that'll lead us into this week's discussion, is you need to calculate your caloric and specifically carbohydrate intake through the race. And we'll discuss that again at the toward the end of the season, where you really need to focus on it. Right now, more importantly, you need to focus on low heart rate, building that base that we talked about last week. We're going to talk about again tonight at greater detail, and where you're utilizing more fat, because you have every human on the planet has a much greater abundance of fat than we do, shall we say, carbohydrate or glycogen, right? So lower heart rate work, utilizes more fat. Right now, you want to utilize not taking in carbs, but training your body to utilize more fat. So if you take in more carbs, you're going to use more carbs, right? So there you go. We are using some carbs right now just sitting still, but as the heart rate goes up and up and up, as we discussed last week, you're using more and more carbohydrate and less fat, which I already said. So let's move on to the new stuff. Last week, we discussed this graph where you have this aerobic base down here, where even though your heart rate is going up and up and up and up, you're not utilizing that much. Excuse me. This line down here is lactic acid output. You could think of it as stress, right? So you're not using that much more fat, and also your stress levels are not increasing very much at all. And then as you progress higher and higher heart rate, then you start using more and more carbs, and you have aerobic, you have lactate threshold. We discussed this last week. Anaerobic conditioning, excuse me, aerobic conditioning, and then anaerobic threshold AT. And there you go. Those are your thresholds. But here is something very interesting we did not discuss last week. This is a beginner athlete. You'll note this one, there's a good, strong baseline, 1.53 millimeters of lactate, MMOLs, millimeters of lactate, going up about 15 beats per minute in heart rate. Up here, 15 beats per minute, 114 to 129 roughly. About 15 beats increase, and you're only getting like, what is that? Less than 0.2, 0.19 increase in millimeters of lactate. But look at this next one. This is an experienced athlete. Look at this beginner. This is going up right away. That one was at 1.53. This one's already starting at 2.27 millimeters of lactate. You're even below at heart rate, and you're higher at millimeters of lactate. It's automatically, stress levels are automatically going right up right away. And you're immediately increasing, what is that, about 1.5 millimeters of lactate. This is the beginner chart in about, again, about 10, 12, call it 12 beats increase in heart rate, where here in 15 beats in heart rate, you're only going up like 0.2, not 1.5, but 0.2. Get the picture? So this person, they're on easy street, right? Easy is easy for these people, even though they've started out, their heart rates have increased a little bit, but the beginner is immediately feeling stress right from the start. And that's an important thing, which we'll talk about the psychological implications of that kind of mid-season. But that's an important thing to recognize, because one of the things that you really want to focus on, like I just said, is with experience, you get this greater baseline where it stays low, that the stress levels stay low, your fat consumption stays higher, right? Your aerobic, meaning without oxygen, you need oxygen in order to metabolize fat. So when you hear aerobic, you're really talking about using fat more than anything. You're still using some carbs, but way more fat at this aerobic easy level. Most your marathon needs to be at that aerobic level. Because if you're an LT, a little higher than marathon race pace, just a little bit higher, you only got about an 80, 90 minute window. For this person, call it 135 heart rate to 138. This person would have about as do most of us, about an 80, 90 minute of carbohydrate consumption in the form of glycogen before even they hit the wall. Got it? So, but their heart rate, and this is what we're going to get into today with speed work, their heart rate is still pretty low, and they're still using fat at a lower heart rate. And so with speed work, and I'll show you discussion of this in a minute, or we'll get into it in a minute. With speed work, your heart rate, your threshold will change. It will either go higher or it'll go lower. Okay. This person definitely has a lower consistent heart rate. They're beginning their aerobic base at about 114. They're only going up to about 129 for their aerobic base, that range. So this would be considered where, 114 to 120 for this person would pretty much be considered easy pace. And then when you get to like 125, 130 for this person, now you're talking more like marathon race pace. But when you get above 130, call it 135 to 138, now you got that 80-minute to go window before your subconscious brain on this person would just say, okay, that's it. We're shutting it down. We're running really low on carbs. Got it? In the form of glycogen. So, okay. So let's dive into that a little more. Whoops. Forward. There we go. Good. So I want you to take a look at this, and I want you to take a look at the other one, and I want you to compare them side to side. And that's what this next picture, this next slide is going to show. And here's another trick question. Here's the first slide where you have a good, strong aerobic base. It only goes up like 0.2 millimeters of lactate in about 15 heartbeats per minute from 114 to 130, right? And this one, you're off to the races. This is the beginner. This is the advanced, right? Now, I want to tell you a secret, kind of another trick question that no one is going to get the answer to. But I want you to think about it. That's why I'm going to pose the question, and then I will tell you the answer. I want you to think about this. This graph, this beginner graph, I mean, this is a real prime example of what I'm about to talk about. So here we go. This graph was done around 1 o'clock, and then this graph was done, I should say, starting from like 1 to 2. From about 1 to 2, about 24 hours later. So this one was done the day before. This one was done the day after. Here's the kicker. These two graphs were done by the same person 24 hours apart. First graph, second graph. I should say first test, second test. Now, how the heck did that happen? How did this beginner go to this dramatic and advanced athlete? What the heck is going on here? Because that's not possible. Or is it? Because this really was, I'm not lying, this really was the same person 24 hours before this. Anybody care to blurt it out the answer? All right, I will tell you the answer. It is a real trick question, but it absolutely hammers home a very, very important point that I want you to know and understand, because I get this a lot. And I'm always glad to answer questions. I don't care, But something that you ought to know. This first slide, the beginner, was done by a person, the same person. I'm not kidding. There's no trick to that. The beginner that was done on a stationary bicycle. They hooked this person's bike up to a trainer. The trainer was hooked up to a computer. And this person did this graph as blood lactate, obviously, because the lactic acid line. And these numbers here, the heart rate is when they took a blood test with these little squares and they line up with the lactic acid that it showed on the test result here. And then here's another blood test, and here's another blood test, and then here's another blood test, and they all line up. So this was done on a bicycle. And 24 hours later, same person, I'm not kidding, this was done on a treadmill with the person running. Key point takeaway, this person was not an advanced cyclist, this same person a day later was an advanced runner. The key is if you want, this is triathlon talk, if you're into triathlon, but for all of you, if you want to be a good runner, you need to run. If you want to be a good cyclist, you need to cycle. If you want to be a good swimmer, you need to swim. That is the total sucky part about triathlon, although I love doing all three of those things. And in fact, this was my blood lactate tests many, many years ago, in 2004, before I was getting ready to do a big race, triathlon. But so, having said that, there is a caveat to this. Now, cycling training will obviously work your cardiovascular system, meaning your heart, your lungs, all of that. So cycling is a benefit in that way, to running because it strengthens your heart, right? So you don't necessarily need to do all that running to still strengthen your heart, but it will not raise or increase or change your VO2 max, your anaerobic threshold. Your VO2 max and your anaerobic thresholds are basically the same thing. One, your VO2 max measures oxygen, and the other, your anaerobic threshold measures where you stop using fat and you're only using glycogen. So if you're anaerobic without oxygen, that's where you're only using carbohydrate. And if you're VO2 maxed out, so you get to a point where you're no longer using oxygen, that means you're no longer using fat. It's the same deal, right? So when you hear VO2 max, anaerobic threshold, that demarcation in heart rate, that's pretty much the same thing. Okay. They're just looking at it in a different way. But yes, you can benefit your running by cycling, but only because you're strengthening your cardiovascular system. You're working on that cardiovascular system. You will not increase your VO2 max, your anaerobic threshold, same deal, or any of your other thresholds. All of those things that we looked at here. Those lines will not change from cycling if you want to be a better runner. Got it? So it's a really important point that's a good takeaway. So the big ticket item for tonight, what do you do to raise, or let's say make it more efficient, this aerobic line? How do you raise your heart rate and you're still going to increase that baseline so your millimeters of lactate are not going to increase and your heart rate will increase? Or when you're running faster, right? This doesn't show speed, but when you're running, actually, if you look at it, it was connected to a computer similar to the bike. This is on a treadmill, and the heart rate is going higher and higher and higher because the treadmill is connected to a computer, and the computer is taking it faster and faster and faster. So you can understand this person, me, at this time, is actually going faster and faster and faster as the treadmill gets faster and faster. So that's why the heart rate is increasing. So how do you either go faster and lower this aerobic peak line so that your blood lactate does not increase and your heart rate is not higher, or you're increasing your aerobic threshold, this blue line, so your heart rate is higher and your millimeters of lactate have not gone up much, if at all. How do you do that? Which is key any marathon, because like I just said earlier, you need more fat to get through a marathon than you need carbohydrate, right? Every human has a limited volume of carbohydrate, but you have a huge volume of fat. The answer to that question is threshold training, where you're running at about 10K pace, maybe even faster. You're talking about the time spent at different heart rate, a higher heart rate. So you would need to be, this person would need to be probably the best result would need to be about 147. If this person was at about a 147, certainly anaerobic threshold, certainly about a 138, 140, that's going to start raising your threshold. Got it? That's going to start raising this line, your aerobic threshold. So you will be able to use fat at a faster, or, well, shall we say higher intensity? Because don't forget, when you're going up a hill, that's higher intensity, even though you may be going slower and your heart rate may stay the same because you're going slower, but it's higher intensity. So when I say intensity, it's, we're talking about going up a hill, going down the hill, whatever it is, hotter day, your heart rate's higher, lack of sleep, your heart rate's going to be higher, headwinds, your heart rate's going to be higher. How do you maintain the same threshold level, same relative heart rate, but no real increase in millimeters of lactate? Well, there you go. Anaerobic threshold training, aerobic conditioning, and anaerobic threshold. That's going to raise your peak aerobic threshold. Got it? And that will also raise your VO2 max, where your anaerobic threshold, that's this orange line right there. It'll raise that line as well, where you're no longer using any fat at all. I mean, even in here, you're still using some fat, right? You're using more carbs and less fat, but you're still using fat until you hit this line here. So this is years ago, my thresholds change with training, but back then when I was at 147 heart rate, there was no use of fat at all. Fat was no longer consumed at all. People will actually, training for a marathon, they'll come with the intent to lose fat and get leaner by training for a marathon, and they'll end up putting on fat. Why would that be? And the answer is they're doing too much training, like in here at lactate threshold or even above, where you're using more carbohydrate. The first thing you do when you're done, you eat carbohydrate and you put it all back on again.
What's
So you're not
happening?
really losing any fat. Got the picture? There are a lot of people that really come to marathon training to get leaner and stronger looking and whatever. And they ended up putting on fat because they're training too fast. They're training too high a heart rate, too high an intensity. They're not doing their majority of their work in this aerobic zone where they're using more fat as a resource for fuel. Got the picture? And that's why we don't want you guys to take in a lot of gels, right away. Use it up, or more of it. Use more of those carbohydrates up so they don't turn into fat. Because at the end of the day, when you go to sleep, when you haven't used up your carbohydrate volume for the day, right, that turns into fat. And if you take in too many carbohydrates all at once, your pancreas creates insulin, and that insulin pushes all those carbohydrates and turns it into fat cells, right? So if you take in way too many carbs all at once and you're not going out and exercising, and it's not in the form of fruit or something where there's a lot of fiber, fiber slows down absorption rate. So you're not going to suddenly be spiking your blood sugar level and spiking your insulin level to get rid of that massive volume of blood sugar. During a race, you should understand, I'm just throwing this in, I just popped into my head. You should know that, yes, gels are pretty much all processed sugar and minerals and some water, to make them gels, right? But The processed sugar while you're running, run walking, or walking. By the way, all of these things pertain to runners, run walkers, and walkers. We all have a heart, we all have lungs, we all have the same internal functions. Um, all humans. Um, your body has the ability to absorb more of those carbohydrates more quickly because you're using them more quickly. So your body says, okay, let's hold off on that insulin. Don't generate all that insulin yet. Let's use those carbs because we are using them pretty high rate right now. So that's why we're capable of taking in gels. If you ever took in a gel while you were just sitting there, while you were watching TV, and you remember what it was like to eat a box of cookies when you were a kid, and for a minute, your energy levels spiked because your insulin levels spike, and then your insulin levels take out all that sugar, and your energy crashes, and you feel, oh my God, I have no energy whatsoever, and you may even pass out and fall asleep. It's because you've just taken in way too much sugar at lower heart rate. But like I just said, we can do gels with processed sugar. That's what they have. While we're exercising, running, run walking, or walking with a little elevated heart rate and even at aerobic zone, you'll note 114 is not an at rest heart rate. It's still a slightly elevated heart rate. The average person at rest heart rate would be 65 to 80 beats per minute. And of course, we're not talking about that's a person more or less at rest. That's not a person that's really just starting out their day where you just wake up. Um, where that's a that for the let me explain. At rest heart rate for the average person, where you first wake up in the morning or you've been sitting still for at least an hour, would be on the normal person 65 to 80 beats per minute. For most of us athletes, runners, run walkers, walkers, where we're using our heart rates, getting our heart rates a little higher for a short period of time during our exercising, right? Maybe, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever it is, we tend to have lower at rest heart rates. Okay. So it's nowhere near 114. You could have an at rest heart rate of, even in the 40s or 50s, let alone 65 to 80, which is the average. Got it? I tend to have, an average at rest heart rate in the 40s somewhere, like lower 40s. I've even gotten down to as much as, 38 beats per minute when I first woke up in the morning, which shocked the hell out of me because, I thought, oh my God, I'm dying. I was just doing a lot of volume back then, and my at-rest heart rate was lower. Your at-rest heart rate will come up when you're fatigued. Even when you wake up in the morning, you take your at-rest heart rate from your pulse in your neck and just time it out. You could count 10 seconds, how many beats came in 10 seconds, multiply that by 6, and you have your beats per minute, right? That's what, but if your heart rate is a little higher, then your body needs more recovery time. Then it doesn't mean that you desperately need to like take the day off. It doesn't mean that you couldn't do a speed work, but it means that you're still not 100% recovered. You might want to consider, do I want to do speed work this morning? Could I wait till the evening till I'm a little more recovered or a lot more recovered? Um, you may have heard the term heart rate variability. And what that term refers to is exactly what I was just talking about. Heart rate variability is where you may have a watch like my Coros Pacer 2. It's now the new one's the Pacer 3, which is sponsor of the LA Marathon. And I actually really like this watch. It does give heart rate variability now. But what it does is it measures your heart rate during sleep And of course, your heart rate goes up and down with your sleep cycles and all of that. And if your heart rate variability is within a certain range that this watch refers to as normal, your heart rate variability is you're good. If your heart rate variability is low, then depending on how low it is, you may need to recover more. If your heart rate variability is high, you may need to recover more. Or low, you may need more sleep. Or high, you may need more sleep. Basically, sleep, less work. That's all recovery. We're going to get into what recovery is either next week or the week after or so. But that's pretty much it. You raise your anaerobic threshold where you're still using fat as a resource for fuel, meaning, like we talked about last week, a more abundant reservoir for fuel. You can use that at a higher intensity level, higher heart rate, which means you can go faster, longer. That's what those threshold runs are all about. Now, to add a little caveat to that, and then I'm pretty much done. To add a little caveat to that is the three threshold runs are called T pace on your schedule, but then you got this I pace for intervals. That think of T pace anything longer than 1 mile, right? If you're doing like a 5K, 10K, that kind of thing, that's that range, that's T pace. Okay. Usually it's within like 4 minutes to 20 minutes, roughly speaking. We do in most of the schedules have like a 40-minute at T-pace run. You may not quite hit T-pace for many of you, but on that 40-minute at the very, very end of your schedule, at the end of the season. But you have I-pace. Think of that as about half a mile to a mile or 800 meters to 1600 meters. That's faster still and usually shorter periods of time, like 2 minutes to 5 minutes, something like that. Then you get R pace, and I'll discuss the ramifications of what you benefit from with those. R pace is usually on our schedule, like the 2-minute run and 2-minute walk. Those things on our schedule. Repetition, meaning you do one thing, then you do the next, on and on and on in repetition. Think of our pace as 200 meters to about half a mile or 800 meters. Got it? So you're talking about once half around the track to twice the way around the track, or I pace twice around the track to 4 times around the track, or T pace more than 4 times around the track, whatever, or 4 times around the track or more. That would be 1600 meters or a mile or more. So our pace, and this is something we're going to get into neurology coming up, but recognize our pace is engaging faster muscles, and I pace is doing that as well, but you're also still getting a little threshold work. So the different paces, even in speed work, T pace, I pace, and R pace, do slightly different things. Got it? So I would have to say for a marathon, because you want to go longer, faster, threshold would probably be your biggest bang for your buck in training, which is why we have a little more threshold work on your schedule. A guy named Jack Daniels, in his book, Daniels Formula, having nothing to do with PhD in exercise physiology, was one of the top, he's in his 90s now, one of the top pro Olympic coaches in our country years ago. And he wrote a rather definitive book decades ago on marathon training. And he even suggested that for marathon training, you want about 12%. Let me take a step back. You want about 20% of all your work done at about high heart rate work, just broad character, higher heart rate. You probably heard the term 80-20. You want about 20% or more. Some of our schedules have less than that because my fear is people will get injured who are at slower paces. That's what our leveled schedules are about. I've discussed that in the past. All right. So Of that 20%, you want about 12% threshold work. You want about 8% faster than that, is what even he is suggesting. And roughly speaking, that's about what you get on our schedules of that volume that you get of threshold work. Now, excuse me, higher heart rate work. Um, I should say our level one schedule really doesn't have any R pace work because we don't want to get you injured. And I think only has one workout at I pace, and it's like 2 minutes or something. It's like nothing. And then level two schedule, very similar. Level three does have threshold interval repetition, and a little more. But then when you get to level four schedule and level five schedule, you get way more like the 80/20 that PhD Jack Daniels is talking about. And the name, he has nothing to do with the whiskey and all that. Anyway, so that's about it. We've already gone through all that. This we'll get into in another time, lactic acid, and that has to do with these slides. Lactate, this bottom line is lactic acid. We'll talk about that another time because we're already running overtime a little bit. But with that, I thank you all for chiming in. And to that, I say to all of you, if I can get to it fast enough, whoops, um, I wait a minute. Here it is. Train smart and train to win. Because if you don't, you won't. And if you do, you just might. I thank you all for chiming in tonight. I will see you all at the finish line. There you go. Good night, everybody. I am going to stay online to answer questions, but we decided that we were going to turn off the microphone. So I will say to those watching the recorded version of this, I will say good night to everyone live. Stay on. We'll answer all of your questions. And here you go. Good night, those of you watching the recording.